So we're joined now by our first official group chat guest. He is the video investigations journalist with the New York Times Malachy Browne. Malachy, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So first of all, can you tell us a bit about the work that you've been doing, particularly on the situation in Ukraine, Malachy?
Yeah, our work on Ukraine began before the war started. In fact, we had a team over there on the ground along the front lines, documenting the preparations, that the Ukrainians were making, and also just, monitoring those satellite images that were coming out that everybody saw in the lead up to the war. And then when it started, so much of it was being documented and captured by Ukrainian citizens right across the country. That first night, there was a barrage of missiles that hit multiple cities right across Ukraine, even right over 150 kilometers from the Polish border. And so we were frantically trying to collect and verify and publish what we knew about what was happening. We had, journalists in various cities on the ground as well, so they were feeding back. So it was very much a breaking news story for the first few weeks. In fact, we sent some of our team over to Europe so that we would have 24-hour coverage. And so that was it. It was collecting these, nuggets of information and visuals that were emerging from across the country so that we could document what was happening and verify that information and combine it with the reports from our correspondents on the ground. And then over the last couple of weeks, we've been, as the intensity of that has sort of eased off a little bit, we've been doing more deeper dive stories.
Malachy, can I ask then, when you get to that process and you find a video that's interesting from someone who is in Ukraine, how do you begin that process then of investigating whether it's real, what it actually says about the situation? Because we've been talking about Bucha, and that's obviously been a very, very high profile situation, which you guys have been able to verify. So could you show us about that process of how you go about that from when you see that first video that starts things off?
It begins, with your preparation before the event happens, actually. So in the weeks beforehand, we're lucky enough to have a couple of Ukrainians on our team. And in the weeks beforehand, we were also collecting the Telegram channels of towns and cities across Ukraine and monitoring those. And in the course of doing that, you kind of get a good sense of what's a good source of information and what, the more sketchy ones. And so I'm building Twitter lists as well, doing the same on other platforms, watching community Facebook groups and things like that. So you have some sort of sense of the quality of the information, but you still need to vet every one. And it's the old practice that we used to do back at Storyful when I was working there, up to 2014, was where did this happen, when did it happen, and who's posting it? Now in Ukraine, it's difficult sometimes to establish who's posting it. Because a lot of the towns are aggregators and people are filing in content. But as I say, you get a sense of what a good source is. And the other ones then are, comparing it with satellite imagery or Yandex imagery. Yandex is quite good for Ukraine, and the equivalent of Google Street View. Archival photographs that people have uploaded on Flickr or onto those platforms and tagged in those locations so that you're confirming where it is. And then establishing when this happened. I mean, we're relying on our correspondence, weather reports, and then cross-corroboration with, say, live streams of the cities and other sources of information. So it's never one sort of source. It's always like, who's your second source, who's your third source, and stacking all of these little factoids that give you confidence in a particular piece of content or information. And that can be useful as well, not just in, just very quickly, not just in those images, but in characterizing how we're presenting what's happening and what the headline should be on the homepage at the New York Times as well.
Malachy, you mentioned a lot of the satellite imagery that you use, and that would be, new to a lot of people. People might have thought of using Google Street View, but they would never think of having some sort of satellite imagery. Do you have open source access to some satellite imagery, or where do you get that from so that you can use it for comparisons? And do you ever wonder, given the amount of misinformation that's going on, whether some of the imagery that you're being fed to use as a reference point is actually true itself?
Yeah, good question. we have a satellite expert on our team, Christoph Kottel. He was one of the first hires onto the team 5 years ago. And he has built relationships with Planet and Maxar Technologies. And so we have access to their proprietary platforms and imagery. And so, the question on Sunday was, is what Russia is saying true? Or because photographers got in there on April 1st and documented these bodies, they weren't able to access them prior to that, but the satellites are imaging that every day, circling Bucha and other parts of the world, taking photographs. And so by going back through March, I was able to match, basically see the bodies on the street in the exact position in which they were found on April 1st. And those images, they weren't the highest quality. So then I contacted Maxar, and they very quickly sent other images that they hadn't published that were much clearer and higher definition. And you could see the orientation of the bodies. You could even see the clothes, the shade of the clothes on one of the victims. And so this was absolutely, those bodies on those streets for weeks. And critically, at the time when Russia was in control of the area, and that rebutted their denials of the denials that they were there at the time that these atrocities happened.
And Malachy, so often we hear that saying truth is the first casualty of war. And you talked there about getting a sense of a good source. How does one get a sense of a good source in a war zone in a situation like that?
Whether over time their information stands up, or whether they are, to use my old colleague Gavin Sheridan's phrase, scraper McScrapey, where they're just ripping stuff from all over the internet and just pushing it out there without any fact checking. So that's what you do. You just judge the quality of the information by your own independent reporting, whether they're a good source or whether but you need to fact check everything anyway. So it just helps you in that first step, and to cut through sort of the fog of war and the chaos of all of that information, because there's a lot of it coming out.
And when you see Russia, Malachy, when they actually call out your work, like state media in Russia has shown some of the satellite imagery that you've used in your investigation to prove what happened in Bucha, and they're just calling it a flat lie. How do you guys react when that happens? Because you obviously have a familiarity. You've won your Pulitzer for your work in identifying a Russian strike on a hospital in Syria. So you're familiar with the handiwork here. How do you react then, I suppose, when they call you out and just, despite all the evidence in the world, are saying, no, this isn't us?
Well, we respond to it if they provide facts and evidence to counter it. We'll examine that, absolutely. But even yesterday, the Russian UN ambassador at the Security Council was calling it, lies on that platform. And in fact, such was their outrage that they were being accused of association with these killings, that they called for an emergency United Nations meeting. But that's the kind of the Russian playbook that we've seen over the years. They will sort of manufacture their evidence, or to quote Kellyanne Conway, use alternative facts to present some sort of narrative and just outright, deny it, but without any actual evidence. And so there's only so much attention that you pay to that, and you just kind of continue to do your work. To get back to your other question about whether you can prove these satellite images are from that particular day, you can. There are scientific shadow calculators for a certain place at a certain time on a certain day, and you can see the lampposts that are there, and so you can do a quick calculation on that, and even there are websites that allow you to go to that location and show what the shadow would be like, and then match up perfectly. And all of these satellites send the metadata, the hour, minute, and second that they took the image when they're being up there, when they're being posted. But I don't know if you saw last night, we also posted pretty conclusive video. Well, it's absolutely conclusive video of the Russians firing on a cyclist along that same street as they turned the corner. So that's very difficult for the Russians to deny.
It's really interesting, just the process behind it. It is like putting a jigsaw together. Can you tell us a little bit about how your team works together? I mean, you must have a particular personality type to be the sort of person who's able to sort of find these things and look for that needle in the haystack.
Yeah, we've a great team. It's an international team, and a mix of backgrounds and language skills, and then technical competencies in terms of the reporting. This is quite a technical type of reporting, and then we have video editors and animators as part of the team. But it's a very collaborative process, and so it requires a certain sort of approach and personality, if you like. Folks who are not fighting each other for the byline and that kind of stuff. So, it's kind of the open source community where, you share your information and you work together to solve that jigsaw puzzle as you describe. So it's, animators, editors, story producers, and script writers, as well as the reporters then, who are quite adept at just kind of turning over rocks all over the web and finding information. 2 weeks ago, the team published intercepted radio communications, again, this time of Russian soldiers on the ground in Ukraine. You'll remember that they destroyed some communications towers. They would have required those for their secure communications, and so they were forced onto open frequencies that could be recorded and intercepted, and even people could join the conversations. And we were able to verify those recordings by matching it up with what the Russians were doing on the ground. And there's evidence also of potential war crimes in there, where they're saying, let's withdraw our property, our armor, and we're going to bomb that civilian area. They also talk about their logistical problems and their problems getting supplies and whatnot.
Well, Malachy, thank you so much for joining us. I think we all agree the work you're doing right now is very important, and we really appreciate it. And thanks to you and your team. Thanks for joining us on the group chat.
Thanks, Malachy.
Thank you.
Thanks for the interest.